Tennessee on August 6, 1882. We also helped tame and settle the American Wild West. Case in point, Haji Ali, who was born around the year 1828 in Syria, and at some point prior to 1856 completed the Hajj. In 1856, he entered the United States at Indianola, Texas, with a shipment of 33 camels. Now, let me digress for a moment. Jefferson Davis was then Secretary of War. And Jefferson Davis had this concept of introducing a camel cavalry into the American Southwest. This was his great experiment. Of course, Americans knew absolutely nothing about camels. They didn't know how to feed them. They didn't know how to care for them. They didn't know how to ride them. So the obvious solution is you brought in a camel expert. And that camel expert was Haji Ali. Now, if you look in the American history books, you probably won't find Haji Ali talked about, because Americans had just a terrible time getting their tongue around Haji Ali. And so they called him Hi Jolly. And you'll find Hi Jolly mentioned quite a bit in American history. Over the next 46 years after arriving in the United States, Haji Ali spent over 30 years working for the United States Army, variously as a camel tender, a wagon packer, a scout, etc. In addition, in his off time from the cavalry, he ran camel caravans in the American Southwest and mined for gold. He became a U.S. citizen in the year 1880, taking the name of Philip Tadro. Later that year, he married and eventually fathered 2 daughters. He died at Tyson Wells, Arizona on December 16, 1902. At the time of his death, he was one of the most beloved and colorful characters of the American Wild West. In fact, the state of Arizona erected a large monument over his grave, topping that monument with a large copper camel in remembrance of Haji Ali's service to the United States. In summary, we Muslims have a long and glorious history and heritage in America. We are not Johnny-come-lately to America. We've been there all along. We helped build America, and our heritage as Americans is firm for all Muslims. As to all that I have said, God knows best.
Well,
Thank you very much.
It turns out the British did not invade Sapelo Island, Georgia, so his judgment was pretty good in the long run. Had he refused the request and the British not invade, there may have been consequences. Yeah, this was an American convert. Some sources say he was the first American convert, but who knows? He was the son of a wealthy person from the East Coast, as I recall, but he sort of made his mark in journalism in the state of Missouri, and then had some diplomatic assignments in Southeast Asia, as I recall, and converted to Islam and started a sort of an Islamic propagation society in America. This would be around the year 1880s. Well, in terms of the slaves, you know, at the time, nobody was interested in writing their history. You have to consider the mental mindset that was going on in America at that time. You know, for many, many Americans, the slaves were merely beasts of burden. You know, it was an extremely cruel period in American history. So their history typically wasn't recorded at the time. Now, there were a couple of exceptions. Ibrahim Abdul Rahman was a slave in Mississippi whose history got recorded at the time, but it got recorded for very special reasons. Ibrahim Abdul Rahman was a prince from a West African kingdom. And the way the story goes, as a young man, he was a colonel in his father's cavalry. His father was the king. And a Scottish physician who was the ship's physician on a British ship that had docked on the West African coast, decided to go for a walk. And he got lost and traveled way inland and was found half dead by the people of Ibrahim Abdul Rahman. And he was nursed back to health and stayed with that tribe for some time, and then announced his intention that he wanted to go back to England. And the king sent soldiers to accompany him to the coast and provided him with gold so that he could return to England. Some years later, Ibrahim Abdul Rahman was captured by slave traders and sent to the Americas, and was enslaved in the area around Natchez, Mississippi. And he was in slavery for years and years and years until he was an elderly man. He had managed to work his way up the slave hierarchy to the point where he was allowed to have his own little vegetable garden. And he would grow vegetables in this vegetable garden, and he was allowed on Sundays to go into Natchez, Mississippi, and sell his vegetables so that he could have just a little bit of money to his own name. This was unusual, but alhamdulillah, it happened for him. And as he's on the street there in Natchez, Mississippi with his cart of vegetables, he sees a white man riding a horse down the street. And you have to remember that Ibrahim Abdul Rahman had been a professional cavalry officer in his father's army. And from the way the person rode the horse, he recognized the Scottish physician that he hadn't seen in 40 years. Well, the Scottish physician dismounted, came over to look at the vegetables, and recognized Ibrahim Abdul Rahman, and immediately embraced it. Now, you have to put yourself in the mindset of the early 19th century in Natchez, Mississippi. Here's a white man embracing an African slave publicly on the street. But not only did that, he immediately took Ibrahim Abdul Rahman by the arm and marched him to the governor's house and introduced him to the governor as being a sovereign prince from West Africa. Well, the story got around that this guy was a prince. And so a newspaper editor came and interviewed him and wrote some stories about him, and suggested that Ibrahim Abdul Rahman write a letter back to his family in West Africa, asking for their help in securing his freedom. And the newspaper editor promised he would take care of mailing it. And that did happen eventually. And because the United States at that time only had diplomatic relations with Morocco, the letter went to the royal family of Morocco. Fortunately, they knew Ibrahim Abdul Rahman's family. And so they immediately began pressuring the United States to release Ibrahim Abdul Rahman and send him back to West Africa. And eventually that happened. And then Ibrahim Abdul Rahman made a long journey from Mississippi to the eastern seaboard, in which he lectured to raise money to buy the freedom of his children and grandchildren that were still in slavery in Mississippi. And Ibrahim Abdul Rahman had undergone a public conversion to Christianity. And one of the things that he would do was to raise money was to tell people that he was going to go back to Africa and be a missionary and convert the Muslims to Christianity. Well, at one stop in Philadelphia, a minister came up to him, Christian minister, and asked him to write the Lord's Prayer in his own language. And Ibrahim Abdul Rahman granted the request and wrote it. That piece of paper still exists. And it's a very interesting piece of paper because the writing is Arabic, and what was written wasn't exactly the Christian Lord's Prayer. It was Al-Fatiha. So, we have another case of an enslaved African who underwent a sham conversion of Christianity basically to save his life. Eventually he did